my pet peeves is that academia has a bogeyman. It's a hideous, evil force that lowers GPAs and eats diplomas. It can banish students and ruin careers. It can haunt you from beyond the grave. This monster is called plagiarism. Okay, so I swear it's not actually as mysterious and terrifying as everybody makes it sound. It's a problem, but it's also an easily preventable one. So it's time to tame this monster with a little knowledge and some best practices. But what does plagiarism actually mean? The word plagiarism actually comes from the Latin word for kidnapping. Since authors think of their writing like their children, it's basically like stealing a kid and pretending that it's yours. Or, if you prefer, you can think of it as being like an alien abduction, and a 14-year-old alien is passing you off as their science homework. While the idea of literary kidnapping goes back as far as the 1st century CE, in English, it first appears in the 17th century. The playwright and poet Ben Jonson used the word to warn off those who would kidnap his work and pass it off as their own. But not every place in the world treats plagiarism in such a harsh light. In our own neck of the global woods, passing off someone else's work without attribution is treated like a moral failure. This comes from Western notions of individualism and the concept that people can claim ownership of ideas just like you can physical things. But in some other parts of the world, like China for instance, there are different beliefs about individualism and differing ideas about what a person can own. This can lead to conflicts about whether or not you should always give attribution to borrowed material. But what does plagiarism mean today and in our cultural setting? To put it in the simplest terms, plagiarism is what happens when you stop making a clear distinction between your contribution to the conversation and somebody else's. We generally paint this in really nefarious terms, where a villain takes somebody else's hard work and then pretends that it's theirs to reap the benefit. Obviously, this is plagiarism. But even intentional plagiarism doesn't always involve mustache-twirling villains. It's just as likely to be motivated by panic, procrastination, and poor decision-making skills. But a lot of the time, plagiarism is unintentional, even innocuous. Imagine a project where a person produces 85% of the content, but you and the boss can't tell which parts those are. This is also plagiarism. But it's not malicious. You've just failed to make it clear what ideas are yours and which ideas you borrowed. Think of it this way. If you take 3 kids on vacation and, oops, one of them isn't yours, the parents aren't going to care if you made an honest mistake. Now, I know you're thinking, okay, I get it, but why is it such a big deal in academia? Well, there are really 3 reasons. First, the most important is that creating knowledge is a group effort, and every person who contributes deserves to get acknowledgement. Imagine how you would feel when your work on a group project didn't get you any credit. Second, remember that academic research is a conversation, and a conversation is pointless if you don't know who's speaking. It's just as important to know who agrees or disagrees with your point as it is to know what your point actually is. And third, and most important to your instructors, you're being assessed on the quality of your ideas and how you express them. If we as your teachers can't tell what your ideas are and what's your own expression, then what are we grading? So with that, let's go over 4 basic tips to making sure your research is ethically sourced. Okay, here's the first tip. Not all borrowing needs quote marks, but it does all need attribution to a source. So, in a previous video, we talked about effective kinds of borrowing, and we discussed how there are really 4 different kinds, and these are reference, summary, paraphrase, and citation, the only one that needs quote marks. But here's the thing. Just because you don't use quote marks doesn't mean you don't need a reference. Every kind of borrowing requires you to add an in-text citation and an entry in your works cited page. In some formats like MLA, that means adding parentheses after the information that includes the author, sometimes the year, and location. In other formats like Chicago and Turabian, though, that's a footnote. with all of the publication at the bottom of the page like this. Anything that's not considered common knowledge is going to have one of these citations on it. Okay, that's great, but how do you know if something isn't common knowledge? That takes us to our second tip. If a piece of information is too specific for a trivia question in a pub quiz, make sure to slap a citation on that thing. Or if you want a simpler mnemonic, we can try WWDK. That is, what would Drake know? Drake here stands in for your average person in your average conversation. If Drake's heard of it, probably doesn't need attribution. For instance, let's say you're writing a paper on R&B music and you mention that Erykah Badu covered Drake's song Hotline Bling. Is that the sort of thing Drake would know? Great! No need to attribute. Alright, but what if in the same paper you read this really cool observation about how the idea of phones in her album act as portals to connect to other people? Is that the sort of thing you would expect Drake to have heard in casual conversation before? Not unless he's read Jessica Ancoma's awesome review of the album. So, slap a citation on it. In this case, we'll credit the author who made the observation, Jessica Ancoma, with a parenthetical citation, and in the Works Cited page, we'll put an entry to her review of Badu's album, which is where we heard the idea from. Now this information's Drake approved. Doing this kind of work is an important step to prevent what's called patch writing, which is when you combine your work and other people's work without any distinction. For instance, let's take a look at Erykah Badu's cover of Hotline Bling. Here's everything she borrowed from Drake's version highlighted in orange. Everything else is her work. If this were an academic paper and she didn't give attribution, cellular device would be considered patch writing, a mix of both her writing and Drake's without attribution. But Erykah's smart. She gives Drake and his songwriters full credit for the material she borrows in her album. So, be smart like Erykah. Don't patch write. Cite your sources every time. Our third tip is about knowing when to use quotation marks. If you're summarizing or paraphrasing from your source, any place where you use 2 or more words in a row identically to your source, you need to put quote marks around it. Let's have a look at a paraphrase from Altnoma's review of the album. On the left, we have Altnoma's original writing, and on the right, we have my paraphrase of the same work. If you read through both, you'll see that I've used Altnoma's phrase dangerous yet powerful in my paraphrase. That's Altnoma's good writing, so this would be called an improper paraphrase, or a summary if you were doing one. Literally, all we need to do to fix this is to put quotation marks around those 3 words, dangerous yet powerful. Now this paraphrase is good to go with an embedded citation from Ancoma. Here's our fourth and final tip. Changing the vocabulary of someone else's text without also changing the grammar doesn't make it yours. The term for this, if you do it on a large scale, is called rogeting, after Roget's thesaurus. It's like changing the lyrics of a song, but keeping the melody and then calling it yours. Consider this one. The teensy tiny arachnid climbed into the faucet opening. Groundward advanced the precipitation and lavaged the arachnid away. You can tell what song this is, right? Well, let's ask the internet and see. Yep, even a search engine can still tell us that this is the itsy bitsy spider. And if even Google knows that it's not yours, then you better give somebody credit. For our dirty little writing secret, when you're doing your draft, highlight all your borrowed information in a different color to make checking your citations easier during revision. Since I have every source marked here in a different color, I can go back, double check, and make sure all the parentheses are correct, and when everything's done, I can Control-A, click off the highlighting, and we're good to go. Alright, I'll see you in the next video.